Hi everyone, welcome back. It is me once again, for the last time for a while, speaking to you about the challenges of industrialization in Asia. So the purpose for today is to show the ways in which industrialization in Western Europe shaped global relationships more broadly. And so if we open this course with an emphasis on the global dominance of China, and indeed the ways in which that dominance drove other countries to seek out new ways to get to China because they wanted China's stuff. Today we show a moment where that relationship essentially becomes inverted. Where through the might of industrialization, the power of Great Britain especially was able to assert itself in Asia and force, in a way they could not do before, Asian markets wide open. And the emphasis on the market is especially important for this lecture. On Tuesday, I discussed the main ideological underpinnings of industrialization under the rubric of liberalism. Actually, let me go to my next slide. Under the rubric of liberalism. Liberals, remember, emphasize freedom. They emphasize liberty. They emphasize relieving human beings and societies of the so-called shackles that kept them in place, and indeed kept them in the economic realm inefficient. Remember Adam Smith, who argued that we need a free market for goods and services in order to find not only more efficiency within individual nations, but to increase global wealth more broadly. So, under liberalism, we need to have free markets. We need to have free trade. And so industrialization did two things. It simultaneously gave Great Britain the means to invert the traditional relationship between Europe and Asia, to enable Britain to assert its dominance here in China, and it also provided the justification for doing so. We will all better, the British say to the Chinese, to the Japanese as well, and I will talk about Japan for the first time today. They say to the Chinese, we will all benefit if you would simply engage in free trade. But as you know, China had no interest in engaging in free trade. And it did not have any interest, not only in the 17th century when we began, or excuse me, in the 16th century we kind of began this story. It did not have any interest in the 17th century. It did not have any interest in the 18th century, and it also did not have any interest in the 19th century. So when faced with British might and British arguments, China faced a choice. We can resist British encroachment, or we can accept British power. China will choose resistance. And as we will see, that choice had immense consequences for the history of the world. Now that actually wasn't the only choice China could have made, resist or accept. Another choice would be to adapt, to change attitudes around engagement with the West, and indeed change attitudes around our relationship with Western ideals more broadly. To stop seeing the West simply as barbarians, as people encroaching on our territory, but rather use what the West has learned through industrialization, through liberalization, and use it to our own advantage. And that will be the decision that Japan makes in the course of our story today. So, today I'm going to talk about these choices facing the great Asian powers of China and Japan. I'm going to focus on China because China remains kind of one of the key central actors of our story this whole semester. And I'll conclude by providing the counterexample, as you can see in my outline, of Japan. But in sum, the story of today are two possible responses to the rise of industrial Europe: resist or adapt. China chooses to resist and fails, essentially. Japan chooses to adapt, and as we will see, largely succeeds. Okay. Now, in order to understand the context of this story that really focuses around the era of industrialization, the late 18th and early 19th century, we do need to step back in time just a little bit and catch us up with the story of China. Because as we will see, the Chinese rulers who the British will deal with in the 18th and 19th century were not the Ming, but were rather the Qing dynasty. And we'll have that on a slide in a second. In any case, China generally prospered in the course of the kind of a general prosperity of the world during the late 16th century. The Ming rulers, right, represented here, were largely unconcerned about the arrival of foreigners. They were pretty confident in their own power to determine the relationships they would have with Europeans. And so long as Europeans were providing silver, the basis of the Chinese currency, they were pretty happy to engage in some limited amount of trade with them. This prosperity led to what was in many respects a golden age within Ming China that lasted largely from the end of the 16th century into the middle of the 17th century, when, as part of that general crisis I alluded to a couple weeks ago, the Ming dynasty suddenly collapsed. By the middle of the 17th century, when China undergoes that transformation, they contained about 1/3 of the world population. There was a rising urban culture of theater and complex social relationships that indicated the kind of a gradual rise in living standards throughout China. Ming society remained commercially vibrant, making all of that stuff, the vases and porcelain and silks that the world so desired. Ming China, until its collapse in the middle of the 17th century, looked like it was doing pretty well. I mean, actually not pretty well, extraordinarily well. So the question I want to pose in this kind of prefatory story before we get to the moment where Britain arrives and essentially changes everything is why Ming China collapsed. Why, in the face of all of this prosperity, all of this wealth, did Ming China collapse? Two reasons for the purposes of today. The first was a general degradation of Chinese administrative efficiency. When I first introduced China and the history of Ming China, I tried, to the best of my ability, to emphasize the complexity and maturity of the Chinese government. China, Ming China in the 16th century, early 16th century, 15th century, had, for instance, the most advanced bureaucracy the world had yet seen. It had an advanced educational system to prepare Chinese students to enter that bureaucracy. It had powerful and wise rulers who not only were able to assert their dominance, but to achieve glory in a way that had been unseen, at least in Europe. Things begin to change within the Chinese administration, within Chinese governance, by the late 16th century. This is represented best, not by the last Ming ruler of China, but by the second, I believe, last ruler of China, the Wanli Emperor. All emperors took an honorific, and this emperor took Wanli as his title. This young man ascended the throne of China at the age of 9. So a young monarch, an immature monarch. He grew up in the Forbidden Palace, which I talked about last time I mentioned Ming China. Totally enclosed and out of, ignorant of the wider world. He was unable, in other words, to kind of link his duties as monarch to the actual reality that occurred around him. His day was largely filled with ceremonial functions rather than actual governance. which he mostly left to the bureaucracy itself. And one danger of having a really efficient bureaucracy, a really mature bureaucracy, is that they can usurp power. And in the 17th century, what happens is that the emperors of China, because they are so closed off from the wider world, from the world that they need to govern, loses the ability to actually determine what the bureaucracy, what the government itself will do. An emperor without the ability to control the government is not much of an emperor. His inability, the Wanli Emperor's inability to control his own bureaucracy simply exacerbated the pre-existing problems, and he further enclosed himself off from his responsibilities, which only, once again, led to the bureaucrats taking greater advantage. So the Wanli Emperor's inaction, his inability to govern this prosperous country, is one cause of the sudden collapse of the powerful Ming dynasty. Second cause, the timing of this administrative breakdown coincided with economic problems. Underneath that prosperity were were gradual difficulties in managing the Chinese economy. What happens when you base your economy on a metal that begins to flood your markets? You get inflation. So at first, this new influx of silver coming from the New World leads to stimulating the Chinese economy because more money means more investment and that sort of thing. But eventually, it leads to a decline in the value of the currency, its supply and demand. The more silver that's available, the less it's worth. As silver floods the market, it becomes the primary means of exchange, no longer the basis for currency, but the actual currency. And people who needed to pay their taxes could not afford to get enough of the silver. A spike in silver prices reduces people to poverty and misery by the middle of the 17th century. The peasantry, the vast majority of the population, is in trouble and begins to get ready for a wide-ranging rebellion against Ming authorities. So if you think about all the revolutions we've seen in this class, and I'm not going to belabor the point about the revolution that takes down the Ming, the connecting tissue between taxation, money, and poverty as kind of fomenting the stew that gives rise to violence from the bottom up is represented by 17th century Ming, just as it is in 18th century America and France. Worth thinking about. So, in sum, two reasons for the sudden collapse of the Ming Dynasty. The first, administrative collapse, and the second, economic problems that were somewhat hidden by the general prosperity I introduced my lecture with. Okay, so, by the middle of the 17th century, these two problems, administrative and economic, were affecting daily life in China. Natural disasters that hit China at kind of precisely the wrong moment lead to famine and poverty amongst the great masses. A general breakdown of society within this massive empire provides the foundation for rebellion from the bottom up, led by this man, Li Zisheng. Li Zisheng, the leader of a few thousand soldiers, arrived at Beijing, the capital, in 1644, and was able to seize the city easily, largely because the emperor himself had lost the loyalty of the people and his own military. And indeed, 2 days after Li arrives in Beijing, the emperor hangs himself, the last Ming emperor. Kind of. Li Zisheng does declare himself emperor of the Ming dynasty. Put simply, all of the disruptions that are occurring both in the government and in the economy feeds a rebellion and provides the opportunity for a charismatic leader to take control of this great empire. The fall of the capital in 1644 led to shockwaves throughout the rest of China, providing an opportunity for China's traditional enemies to take over. The Manchu from Manchuria, here in northeastern, present-day China itself. The Manchu from Manchuria will see an opportunity in the disruption caused by the fall of the Ming dynasty and the, the takeover by Li Zisheng. Indeed, what happens is that the remaining components of the Ming army go to Manchuria and ask the Manchu for help in taking down the rebellion. And they agree, seeing an opportunity to not only take over a traditional enemy, but to loot the city of Beijing and take the gold and treasure back to Manchuria. Without a drop of blood, the traditional enemies of Ming China and the Manchu join forces and march to the capital. And indeed, despite their relatively small numbers, they overcame the resistance of the remaining rebels and took Beijing without much trouble. However, the ability of the Manchu to take over Ming China rested on unsecure foundations. They founded what they called the Qing dynasty, currently spelled Q-I-N-G. You might sometimes see it C-H'-I-N-G. That is not the current spelling. It is now Q-I-N-G, but pronounced Qing. And have to figure out how to rule this huge territory. Let me briefly go back to my map. The Manchus coming into China are minorities within this vast empire. Most of those living in China were ethnically Han Chinese, H-A-N. The 1 million Manchu, therefore, were a distinct minority amongst the 250 million people comprising the Chinese empire. And so what the Qing have to do, and what they will be successful at doing for about 150 years, is balancing a number of forces related to their position as minority rulers over a vast majority. And what they will do, and this is why it's significant to my broader story today of the Opium Wars and the invasion of the British, is that they are successful at kind of finding a middle ground in managing their relationships not only with the internal population of China, but with outsiders as well. So for instance, the Manchu largely simply appropriate many of the kind of government functions and modes of organizing Chinese society. They try not, in other words, to disrupt things too much, right? They know they need to rely on pre-existing structures in order to take advantage of China's economic and economy, and geography. However, they still needed to assert that even though they're essentially using the structure set up by the Ming, that they were in charge. So one thing they do is that they require Han Chinese Ming men to take on the hairstyle of the Manchu, which is known as a Q. Q-U-E-U. Close enough. Which is pictured in this image, these little ponytails. So although, and a shaved forehead. right? So imagine me just with a ponytail. What the Ming have done is that they've found a compromise in the way they're going to organize society. They're going to take on the strengths of the Ming, but they're also going to impose just enough of their own values to showcase who's really in charge. They do a very similar thing when it comes to their foreign relations. And what they do is essentially say to those wishing to trade with this gigantic economy, well, we accept some trade, right? So this isn't really the Ming solution of closing off. It's slightly more open. But what they say is we will only trade essentially in one place, the city of Canton. And in the 18th century, the Qing dynasty sets up what is known as the Canton system, which essentially requires European traders to use Chinese merchants as go-betweens in order to guarantee the good behavior of visiting Europeans. And so just as the Qing were able to find a balance in their internal rule over this huge empire, they also found a way of essentially laying out a foreign policy that covered a middle ground. Yes, foreigners can come in and benefit from the wealth of the great Qing dynasty, but you do so on our terms. So, in sum of this part of the lecture, why is the transformation of the Ming to the Qing dynasty important? Well, it's important because it demonstrates the continuing strength, in some ways ironically, of China itself, and its ability to manage its interactions with others. So even though when the British encounter the Chinese, it's not the Ming they're facing, it is the Qing dynasty, they nonetheless have to wrestle with the great leverage and power that China continues to hold well into the 18th century. Okay. The British, however, don't care. And in many sense, this frustrates Western Europeans. That despite this crisis that the Chinese faced in the 17th century, they remain largely and relatively prosperous and superior to Western Europe in most respects. And indeed, until the beginning of the 19th century, the Qing dynasty will continue to use its military to expand territorially. When the British arrive and attempt to engage in more free trade with the Chinese, the British were in very little position to make demands. However, unlike the British, the Qing dynasty were not innovators. Much like their Ming predecessors, they had a relatively conservative view of what it would take to ensure continued power and continued stability. They were not about, in other words, to allow their citizens to engage in free enterprise, in free markets. That was seen as dangerously risky. Indeed, the Qing dynasty was barely even aware of the massive political, social, and economic transformations that were happening in the Atlantic world. So despite, well, maybe perhaps not despite, you can use the Qing kind of success at moderation to illustrate one of the major weaknesses of the regime, even as it remains in some respects a strength. They were unwilling to engage in the risky behavior that so benefited the British as they began to industrialize. And indeed, it's that kind of decision, that turn of the, that turn away from innovation, that provided the opening that British merchants in particular would need in order to change the balance of power in Asia, essentially forever. And the first incident, that we get of that changing balance of power is in the Opium Wars. two of which will occur in the in the 19th century. And it's the Opium War, the first Opium War in particular, that I'm going to focus on now. So, as you know, Europeans have been selling goods in China for a long time. It was very limited, it was very controlled, it was not free trade, you had to go through middlemen. Tobacco, for instance, a New World crop, became quite popular in China during the 17th and 18th centuries. The popularity of tobacco in the 17th and 18th centuries, however, in many respects foreshadowed a greater problem that the Chinese would face in the latter part of the 18th and into the 19th century. Tobacco smoking in China led fairly quickly to opium smoking. Opium, as you are probably aware, is a highly addictive drug. Highly addictive drug. It leads to lethargy, to a feeling of relaxation. It leads people to close in on themselves a bit. It is not a drug that is healthy for a society to engage in widespread use. It's not like heroin, but it's not good either. The Qing recognized this would be a problem if widespread opium use spread throughout their society, as it would by the early 19th century. And they banned opium imports in 1729. However, the Chinese populace themselves had essentially become addicted to it. And they continued to import the drug throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. And indeed, in 1773, the East India Company, one of those joint stock companies that Dr. Haynes talked about a couple lectures ago, created a monopoly on the growth of the poppy seed and the production of opium in India, where Britain was beginning to really kind of assert its dominance as one of its colonies. And it's in India that most of the opium that would get it into China originated. The economic potential of opium was incredible. And the East India Company was not wrong in turning its attention to opium. So I have an image here of an opium warehouse. Opium was traded in these little like casks. And they would buy in each one of these little dots, if you can see on the screen, and you'll be able to see a little closer when I upload the PowerPoint, is a cask of opium. And just rooms and rooms and rooms of opium flooded the Chinese market. And indeed, this worked out pretty well for the British. The British had a lot of trouble figuring out what the Chinese would buy in exchange for the stuff that ultimately China didn't want. Britain had become addicted to tea, and they were running out of silver, and opium filled the gap in order to fund their tea addiction. By 1804, the British essentially had stopped exporting silver and were largely funding their profits with opium. The effects on Chinese society were as expected. Here is an English engraving of an opium den in China. Noted that it's in Canton, where the opium would have arrived in the first place, showing the British's own kind of the way the British themselves blame the Chinese for their own state. Right? This is an incredibly racialized, racist image of Chinese men enjoying opium, observed by an attendant, that the British in some sense sees the opium trade as the Chinese getting, in many respects, what they deserve. The imposition of opium does two things, therefore. It degrades and disrupts Chinese society because of widespread addiction, and it also transforms China's balance of trade. China, for the first time, is not importing more silver than it's exporting. Silver begins to flow out of China in order to pay for the opium. And that in turn only increased the peasantry's tax burden because there wasn't enough silver to go around. And so opium had very real, not just kind of racist imaginary effects, but very real effects on the Chinese economy. By the early 19th century, China decides to once again and more forcefully ban the importation of opium into China. That demand leads to conflict. And what I want to argue in my lecture, in this story, is that that conflict was essentially about not simply a particular object, a particular item, a trade good, but around two different visions of what it means to be a civilized society. And that, those two definitions about what it means to be a civilized society revolve around definitions of free trade, which I opened my lecture with and indeed discussed during the Industrial Revolution. This is a quote not from a history book and not from a primary source. It's from a novel. It's a novel about the Opium Wars, and it's a really fantastic novel about the Opium Wars. So take it for what you will, but it is really effective at getting what the British believed. The war, when it comes, will not be for opium. It will be for a principle, for freedom. For the freedom of trade and for the freedom of the Chinese people. Free trade is a right conferred on man by God, and its principles apply as much to opium as to any other article of trade. More so, perhaps, since in its absence, many millions of natives would be denied the lasting advantages of British influence. So the argument here is that the conflict that is brewing between Great Britain and China is not about opium. It's about the idea that by definition, free trade is good. It doesn't matter what they're buying. Yeah, they're buying opium. But, free trade by definition is good. We have no right to tell the Chinese what they can and cannot purchase. Because it's the principle of the thing, right? It's the principle of the thing. And note, another reason I like this quote, free trade is a right conferred on man by God. And the British believed that. They believed that they were making the world a better place. And free trade was the way to do it. Free trade was the way to do it. I will ask you rhetorically, since I don't have an audience to actually ask, was opium legal in Great Britain? It was not. So, free trade for thee, not so much for us, right? In other words, the British knew that opium was dangerous. They knew that it was bad for society, and they tried to keep it out of their own urban centers, but they didn't do so for China. So, faced with this argument by the British, the Chinese send a representative down to Canton to intervene in the opium trade. And that commissioner, Commissioner Lin, from your documents today, writes a letter to Queen Victoria, the Queen of the British, and says, and note in that letter, he references that Britain had not banned opium themselves, or had banned opium themselves. After a long period of commercial intercourse, there appear among the crowd of barbarians, that's everyone but the Chinese, both good persons and bad unevenly. Consequently, there are those who smuggle opium to seduce the Chinese people and so cause the spread of the poison to all provinces. This is the key. Such persons who only care to profit themselves and disregard their harm to others are not tolerated by the laws of heaven and are unanimously hated by human beings. What Lin is saying, essentially, is that you can't just emphasize our ability to trade unless you look at what that trade actually does. So the British view, represented by that not fictional quote, is essentially free trade is the principle that is good, and therefore free trade must be imposed. Lin says, well, free trade's a great idea, but let's make sure that the consequences will not be harmful. We need to take into account what free trade will do before we simply say it's all good. And as those of you know, this is an ongoing debate. What are the effects of free trade on the American economy? And in many respects, the 2016 election was about that question. Just today, the day I give this lecture, President Trump has announced new tariffs on steel, right? That the US economy has decided to pull back from free trade because perhaps we haven't paid enough attention to the consequences of it. Something to think about. In any case, Lin was not all talk. Lin arrives in Canton and demands that all the foreigners turn over their opium to the Chinese government. And note, China has every right to do that. China was a sovereign empire. They had banned opium. If you start trafficking drugs in another country, you will be arrested. And the US government will not be able to help you because it's not our problem. Lin does essentially the same thing. He says, you merchants are engaged in an illegal trade, give us your opium. The British refuse, they resist violently, and indeed the second volume of Amitav Ghosh's trilogy on the Opium Wars has amazing scenes of the merchants resisting. And Lin orders the arrest of the president of the British Chamber of Commerce. He blockades 350 foreigners in their own quarters. And he forces the community to surrender 20,283 chests of opium. An estimated value of $9 million, an enormous sum in those days. Indeed, the merchants had overstocked in opium because they thought the trade was going to be made legal. They were quite incorrect. What Lin does instead is he pours the opium into the river, destroying it. The British merchants are not happy about this. They've just lost a lot of money. A lot of money. And what they do is they turn to their government and they say, we have just lost a lot of money. What are you going to do to help us out, British government? The British send warships to protect the British merchants. Think about what's happening here. A company, or actually individual traders, have broken a sovereign nation's law, and those traders, instead of going to jail, instead of accepting their punishment, turn to the government and say, could you please start a war for us? Could you please start a war for us? And the British say yes, essentially. They see their economic interests in maintaining the opium trade, and they send the warships. Four steam-powered warships. The British advancements in technology due to the Industrial Revolution make it so that the Chinese army has no chance. They have no chance. And indeed, the Qing soldiers, yes, armed with some artillery, some firearms, are nonetheless completely overwhelmed by British superiority, technological superiority. So the British have just done the unthinkable. A small island off the northwest part of the Eurasian continent has defeated in war the great Qing dynasty. And the British, in the wake of their defeat, the defeat of the Qing, forced China to accept a series of treaties giving Britain and eventually other Western European powers various rights within China that lead the Chinese to deem these treaties the unequal treaties. The British take the island of Hong Kong, which they would then hold until the late 90s. They force China to accept European trade in not one canton, but 5 ports. They force China to pay back the costs of the war and the value of the destroyed opium, which again was illegal in China. And the British won the right to trade directly with the Chinese. and to live in the treaty ports, so an expanding European presence within China. Later treaties would ensure that foreign nationals would be tried in their own courts for crimes rather than Chinese courts. So I'm a French historian. When I go to France and I do something wrong, I'm going to be tried in France, most likely. That would not occur if I were in 19th century China. If I, as a British subject or a US subject, went to China and, say, killed someone, the Chinese authorities would have no ability to try me. I would get tried in Britain. In other words, what the unequal treaties do through all of these parts is they chip away at Chinese sovereignty. They chip away at Chinese sovereignty. And what has occurred is that the balance of power has fundamentally changed. Through the course of the 19th century, European Western powers, including the United States, would participate in carving China into spheres of influence, forcing China to accept the presence of European power, and indeed to accept the principle of free trade. The Opium Wars are often considered a minor moment in the global history that we are telling today, but they are hard to underestimate in their significance in terms of the ways in which it inverted what had been a traditional relationship between Asia and Europe. I'm at 45 minutes. I'm going to hold off on Japan until a later lecture and let you read about it in your reading. So we will see you next week. Have a good weekend.